Hi, and welcome to our Managing Absence webinar, originally held on the 13th of April 2023. In this webinar, we're going to cover managing absence in terms of preventative and also managing absence when it arises, both on the short term and long term ends of the scale. So, why would we want to spend time managing absence in a small business when there's so much else you could probably be doing and your managers could probably be doing as well? Well, there is a cost to absence, and the current statistics show that the average rate of absence is 7.3 days per employee per year, and that equates to a cost of around or just under £800 per year per employee. So that's quite significant for a small business. Aside from that, there's the disruption to work. If someone is calling in sick, it's last minute, you've then got to work around that, redistribute the workload, maybe cover it yourself, or at least have colleagues covering that work. And that can be quite detrimental both in the short and the long term. We also have to consider the well-being impact of absence. When sickness absence is genuine, it suggests obviously there's a problem with the particular person who is off. Obviously, everybody gets unwell from time to time, and that's normal. But if it is frequent, it's more than the average, or even if it's at that average, because that's quite high, we do want to be making sure that we're taking proactive steps to manage that, to ensure that we can improve the well-being of that individual and the well-being of the team as well. If there is that constant calling in sick where employees are having to cover the workload of someone else, they might be working extra hours, they might be suffering from increased stress levels as a result. So we do need to be mindful that we don't then create that ripple effect with absence where we leave it unmanaged for one person, that then has a knock-on effect on others, and the absence problem grows and grows. So the first step I would suggest to managing absence proactively is to have a really good absence policy that's tailored to your business. So it's not a template that's generic and doesn't necessarily apply. You want to make sure it includes everything that is right for your business in terms of the notification procedures. So, for example, what time do you need somebody to notify that they're not coming in? Is it perhaps an hour before their start time? Is it by a certain time of day? Is it 6 a.m.? That's going to depend on the role that person's doing and your particular type of business. And also thinking about how they should notify as well. Is it via an HR system? Is it email or text? Or is it a telephone call to a particular number? Is there an office number or is it in the manager? We need to think about those things so that it's really clear what that person should be doing in that eventuality. And as I say, we need to be thinking about who is in charge of receiving that notification as well, whether it's line managers, whether it's business owner, whether it's somebody perhaps in an office, but making that really clear in that policy is key. Setting out certification requirements, so what documentation is going to be needed. Often within the first 7 days of sickness absence, we would ask for a self-certification of absence. Following that, once someone has reached day 8 of absence, and that includes weekends or non-working days as well, they will be normally required to submit a doctor's note, a fit note. And we should make that clear as well in the policy. Following on from that, we would want to set out what our return to work process is. And again, this might vary from business to business. It might be that you have a telephone call with someone upon their return. It might be that you have a virtual meeting because maybe you work remotely from one another. It might be a physical return to work meeting. There might be some paperwork the employee has to fill in. Maybe they have to log their absence on an HR system. That's again going to be quite specific to your business. And it sets the expectation that once someone returns from a period of absence, regardless of the length of that absence, this is what's going to happen. So there's no surprises for that person when they do return. Sick pay is quite key to have in the policy as well. So whether you operate a statutory sick pay scheme, in which case you can potentially just refer to the government website if that's easier, or ACAS website for advice for employees on that, or you might want to set out within the policy itself. If you do operate company sick pay, Again, we would want that in the policy. If it's a discretionary scheme, we'd want to make that clear. If there's any qualifying criteria, so if people need to be out of their probationary period, or they need a certain length of service, or perhaps we want to make it clear that only if someone follows the correct notification process and the correct certification requirements will they be eligible for sick pay. So make that really clear in there as well. We would also want to set out what the implications are of absence. So, for example, persistent short-term absence that's managed and cannot be reduced might result in disciplinary action. If someone is long-term sick and we can't find an option for them to return in any capacity, we might end up on capability procedures. So we can put that in the policy again to manage those expectations and refer to that policy in those formal processes if we do need to. We could also make it clear in our policy what we believe long-term absence to be, and we'll come on to this point in a few slides' time, but also what's going to happen in the event of long-term sickness. So perhaps we want to put in the policy that we would ask for consent for a medical report, or we might ask someone to be referred to occupational health. We might want to visit someone at home if they're off on long-term sick. Also, how often we're going to be keeping in touch with our staff if they're off on long-term sick. Maybe an expectation that there might be weekly contact, for example. Again, it's making people aware that this is the normal way that we deal with absence. So if someone does become unwell and is off long-term, they don't then feel targeted or they don't feel worried that they're being contacted in that way, because it's set out in advance that that's what's going to happen. And any trigger points, we'll come on to measuring absence in a second, but if we want to set trigger points to make it clear to employees at what point we believe absence is a problem, we should make that clear in the policy. So we see different ways of doing this, and again, we'll cover that in a few slides' time. But again, setting the expectation that this is actually what we believe to be appropriate levels of absence, and anything over that, we will start having conversations. So what we wouldn't put in the policy is that you'll get a warning or you'll be dismissed if your absence hits this certain level. That's not what we're saying at all, but we're saying that this is a trigger point for a conversation and then potentially an investigation into the causes of absence as well. So recording and monitoring, well, why even bother recording? You record a lot for staff and for the rest of your business as well, but actually taking the time to have a good system for recording absence is really useful, because it does help us to accurately understand when there is a real problem with absence. If we're just going off what we feel is a problem, and maybe someone who's more visibly absent is going to stand out to us more than someone who's maybe absent the same amount, but maybe less frequently, maybe it's just going under the radar a little bit, particularly when we've got home workers and remote workers, it might just not be as visible. So actually having those recorded mechanisms can be really useful for managing absence. It's very hard to manage absence fairly and efficiently, I would say, if there aren't those records, because it's open to debate, isn't it, then, as to what the absence level truly is. And it also helps us to spot patterns. So if there are concerning patterns with absence, such as either side of a weekend, for example, we can spot that more easily if we've got a visual record. And some systems are really good at showing that on a calendar type display, which can really help. And it'll also help us with these measurements, which we'll go on to in a second. One thing I would say on recording absence, what we do sometimes find is that employees might ring in sick and they might ask, particularly if you only operate statutory sick pay, they might ask if they can put through a holiday instead of sickness. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that. You might agree it now and again, particularly if someone doesn't have a poor sickness record. But one thing to be mindful of is that it can affect your absence records. If you've then put sickness absence down as holiday, it's very hard to then manage that, because we've effectively authorised that holiday. So to then manage someone on that basis and say, you know, your absence is out of hand, it's causing us problems, the question would be, well, why did you authorise a holiday then, if it wasn't convenient for the business? So just be mindful of it. And if you are doing that for any reason, and you are allowing last minute holiday requests when someone's unwell, make sure your system does actually show that whilst it was a holiday, this is the circumstances that led up to that. And of course, make sure any records are stored and kept in line with data protection legislation, particularly when we're recording reasons for sickness absence. That's going to be classed as sensitive personal data, so make sure it is held very safely and securely, with only those who need to know that information having access. So on the measurements then, we've got the lost time rate. This is effectively where we say it's a percentage of working time lost to sickness absence. So we see policies where, for example, the trigger point might be 3% of working time lost. So once someone's lost 3% of their working days to absence, we're going to have a conversation. So it's quite a good way of doing it. It's a percentage. That percentage is up for debate as to what your threshold might be. Potentially a benchmark is looking at what your current absence rate is, and looking at whether that's a problem or not when you decide what your trigger point is. The frequency rate is as simple as how frequent somebody is off in perhaps a 12-month rolling period. How many days, how often are they off? The Bradford factor is quite commonly used. It's a good method. It's a calculation which effectively takes into account both the frequency, as in the number of days absent, and the length of those absences as well. So the Bradford factor, or the Bradford score, will actually weight short-term persistent absence as being more detrimental to a business than long-term absence, on the basis that it's more disruptive. So you can set a trigger with the Bradford factor. The lower the number, the better the absence rate. So the higher the number, the worse the problem is. 100 is quite a common trigger point when using the Bradford factor. And again, a lot of HR systems, if you use one, will actually do this automatically for you. So it's quite an easy way to measure. And the good thing with these measurements is that they are factual, they're objective, and they are numbers, so they can't necessarily be argued with. Again, that's one of the problems with measuring, is that they don't necessarily take into account the circumstances around the absence. So we would never use any of these measurements in isolation. We would want to be making sure that whilst we can use this as a backup to check whether the absence is actually a problem when we think it is, we need to be getting to the bottom of the reasons around this, and actually set this out in your policy as well, that, you know, if you do have a Bradford factor trigger point of 100, or you do have a lost time rate trigger of 3%, put that in your policy so that employees know when their absence is going to be brought to their attention. And you can also discuss this in your return to work interviews. We're going to talk about return to work interviews in a bit more detail later, but you can actually bring this up in those interviews to say, look, you know, our trigger point is 100, you're currently at 75, so maybe you'd want to work on your absence at this point to avoid us having to look into it further. You know, that kind of conversation. It can be just helpful to bring that objectivity in. And when I talk about the fact that these measurements don't look at the reasons for absence, we do have to be very careful when we have individuals with a disability and individuals who are pregnant, because we can't really then just put this blanket measurement across and say, look, you've hit our trigger point of 100 on the Bradford score. We're going to start having formal conversations about absence, because if that absence is pregnancy related or indeed related to a disability, we may end up in a discrimination situation. So I would still suggest that you record such absences as normal in the normal way, but what we wouldn't want to do is penalise someone for having a disability or for being pregnant, because that would be potentially in breach of the Equality Act. The definition of a disability is quite wide in the Equality Act. It's effectively a condition that is long term, so 12 months or likely to last for 12 months. It's substantial, and it's a mental or physical impairment. So quite a wide reaching definition, so just be mindful of that. And if someone does have a disability, there is a requirement to reasonably adjust, and that can be again, quite a wide spectrum. So it could be making physical adjustments to the workplace, but actually it might be adjusting our expectations in terms of absenteeism levels. So if we have a Bradford trigger of 100, a reasonable adjustment for someone with a disability, depending on what that disability is, might actually be to amend that trigger for someone with that particular disability. And when it comes to pregnancy, risk assessments are really key. Once you're notified that one of your employees is pregnant, carry out a risk assessment. Make sure you know what those risks are to that lady and child, and make sure we're trying to alleviate those risks. Doing so can help actually avoid absences becoming necessary. Of course, not all pregnancy-related illness can be prevented, but if we keep our risk assessments up to date, we can at least keep on top of that and avoid problems that are caused from unknown work risks. If we are monitoring absence actively, really we should be discounting such absences for that purpose. So again, pregnancy-related illness, we would not be necessarily applying our normal sickness absence monitoring and measuring to those absences, but we could discount those and look at what the overall absence record is to get a more objective view that doesn't penalise someone for a protected characteristic. So I mentioned patterns earlier. One of the patterns that can sometimes be seen with short-term absence is elongated weekends, so the Monday, Friday type absences. Now, of course, sometimes that is coincidental and it's unfortunate, but if it is becoming that the only days that someone has off sick is Monday and Friday, and they also happen to have quite a poor sickness absence record in general, we might be wanting to bring that to their attention. Similar when sickness falls either before or after a holiday. Again, it might be completely genuine, particularly if people have caught a bug on holiday or on the plane home. They might then be unwell when they return. But sometimes as well, looking at those people who keep their sickness absences under that 7-day threshold, so they don't need to get a doctor's note. That could be another pattern that highlights potential concerns. And again, I'm not suggesting that we assume that everybody who has sickness absence on these particular patterns is not genuine, but it does potentially bring about the need to ask questions. So don't make assumptions is what I would say. Whilst it can look suspicious and it can be frustrating as the business owner or manager when you've got these patterns and you're quite convinced that somebody is maybe not being fully genuine, try and just not make those assumptions. So things to not say, you know, you're always off before or after the weekend. That's strange, don't you think? That's quite accusatory, isn't it? And saying things like, I suppose you'll have some excuse or other. Again, we're accusing them there of not being genuine. So it's unlikely to be a productive conversation, and it's also unlikely to actually address or solve the absence problem. So in terms of rephrasing that, you could say, I've noticed that all of your 5 absences have been before or after a weekend. Do you want to comment on that pattern? Again, we're not accusing anybody there. We're simply highlighting a fact, which is that the 5 absences have been before or after a weekend, and we're asking for comment. So there's nothing wrong with asking that kind of thing, and I would actually really recommend that you do if those patterns have arisen. So documentation. I mentioned earlier, self-certification within the first 7 days. This is an internal form, albeit I do believe that there is one on the government website that you can download. And this is a document which effectively asks for the employee to complete it, and they will fill in the reason for absence, the dates, who they reported their absence to, did they see a GP, did they need any treatment. It's those kind of general bits of information so that you've got a good idea as to what happened to lead to that person being unwell. They will also sign that form off as a true and accurate description of their absence. So it's a bit of a declaration. It can help prevent people wanting to tell fibs because telling fibs over the phone can be a bit easier than actually putting ink to paper and signing that off. A statement of fitness for work, or a fit note, is effectively the doctor's note. So once someone has been off for 8 calendar days, so remember that's not working days, it is calendar days, they will need a doctor's note. And the doctor's note will have one of two things on it. It'll either say that the person is not fit for work, which is often what the doctor's note will say, or it'll say that they may be fit for work. And if the doctor has ticked may be fit for work, they will normally then suggest adjustments on the doctor's note as well. So that might be fit for work with amended duties, or with shorter hours, or when working from home, for example. The important thing with those recommendations is that there's no legal obligation on you to comply with those recommendations. Remember, though, if someone does have a disability, you have got a duty to at least consider reasonable adjustments. So I would always recommend giving good consideration to the recommendations in any event, but it is only that. It's a recommendation. If you can't do it, if it doesn't suit the business or the role, we would revert back and treat the doctor's note as though it's saying not fit for work. But those recommendations can be very useful, and it does open up a conversation with the employee as well about what they might be able to do, and how we might be able to get them back to full capacity quicker. And return to work interview, really useful in my opinion for managing absence proactively. I would suggest a return to work interview is done every time someone is off sick, even if it's for half a day. And I'm not suggesting it's a full hour-long face-to-face conversation, but at least some kind of communication, whether it's over the phone or virtually or face-to-face, with a document filled in to confirm that the return to work interview has taken place. And I'll talk a little bit more about return to work interviews on this slide. So first thing that it's helpful to cover in a return to work interview is the welcome back to work, and checking that the person is well enough to return to work. There might be a business update depending on how long the person's been off. We might need to just fill them in, who's been covering their work, what needs doing immediately, has anything changed in the business, has anyone left, joined, just that general update. But checking that they're actually well enough to return is really key. Presenteeism is an issue in a lot of businesses where employees return to work too soon, and that can either result in them being present but not really present, so hence presenteeism, they're not really productive, or it can actually lead to someone then making their health worse and reverting to being off sick. So actually offering that help and support, showing concern for their well-being within this return to work interview can help really ensure that they are okay, and do they need anything else from you in terms of making sure that return to work is successful. And we can also use the opportunity to ensure we really understand what's wrong, what led the person to be off sick in the first place. Sometimes on a self-certification, people might just say that they felt unwell, or they had a cold, but actually we can use this opportunity to have that conversation and say, was that really why they were off? Was it just a cold? Sometimes a cold is the physical symptom, but actually maybe someone is just feeling under the weather. Maybe they're suffering a bit from stress. Maybe it's something else that they didn't want to say initially. So use the opportunity to actually find out about medical conditions. Again, it might be a good opportunity to help understand whether there might be a disability here, and also understand whether there's anything work related that contributed to them being absent in the first place. So work related stress, for example, difficulties with colleagues, workload, anything like that. This gives you an opportunity to make sure that that's not the case. And if it is, start addressing it. It also shows to employees that absence is being managed. So we don't just allow people to walk back into the workplace and act as if the absence never happened. It's part of the process. They know they're going to have this conversation when they return, which in itself can help put people off being off in a non-genuine sense. So pulling a sickie might not seem as attractive when they know they've got to have this conversation. Again, it's one thing to tell a fib over the phone and do a bit of a sick voice. I'm sure we've all heard those. but actually having to sit face to face with someone and tell lies isn't normally someone's idea of fun. So the return to work interview also allows you to discuss appropriate adjustments. So what can we do to ensure that this issue that arose doesn't reoccur in the future? If indeed it is something that might reoccur, if it's just a one-off thing, we might not need to worry about that. But as well, if we are concerned, even if it's not definite to us that someone has a disability, we still might want to start thinking about adjustments to help them, maybe on a temporary basis, but sometimes on a permanent basis as well. Again, similar to what I said in the policy section, discussing the impact and the long-term consequences of absence can be helpful. And I'm not suggesting that we try and make people feel guilty about taking time off. Absolutely, people should be off if they're not well. But actually explaining to someone that, you know, whilst we appreciate that they weren't well and, you know, we're glad that they now feel better, if absence hits one of our trigger points, if we don't see an improvement in absence over the coming months, these are the consequences. You know, we might have to go down a more formal route to see how we can improve absence. It's a fine line because, like I say, we don't want to make people feel guilty, but we do also want to manage their expectations that if their absence is at this point a problem, they know it's a problem and they know that we've got our eye on it. And if we need to take more formal action, we will do. And it's actually fairer to do it like that rather than spring formal action on them later down the line without having given them any kind of informal notice that that was a potential consequence. And agreeing action plans, we can use the return to work interview to set some action. So if actually maybe we've got a trigger point and they've hit it or they're just about to hit it, we can start putting in action plans to bring that absence level down. We might want to set some informal targets on attendance within that meeting. So we might want to say that we need the Bradford score to come down within the next couple of months. We might need to say that we need them to reduce their lost time rate over the next month or two. We might even say that we need them to have no absence now within the next month to show that they can try to improve their attendance. It's okay to have those conversations within a return to work interview. What I would say as well when attending a return to work interview, if you're the manager running the meeting, make sure you come prepared with their past sickness absence record. Also with notes of any past discussions that you've had with them about absence. Because again, it helps you to be factual, it helps you to be objective, and you can also refer them to those facts in the meeting, which helps them to start seeing the absence from a business perspective as well. So if, for example, you can show that the absence rate across the business is an average of 4 days per year per employee, this person's having 8 days per year on average, we can highlight this is why we're concerned. And again, start talking about those action plans for improvement. So, short-term absence, an idea of action planning. Again, first of all, we want to make sure we have actually got the facts. So I would never suggest that you start talking to someone about their absence being a problem if we haven't checked actually that it is. Check their absence record and compare it with other people's. Even if you think you're quite confident that this person's got lots more absence than your average employee, still do that check. We sometimes do that with our clients and ask our clients to send us the absence records for their whole team so that we can do that check for them and just make sure it is indeed this person who is the problem. Again, look for patterns in those records so that you can highlight those to the individual. Arrange a meeting to discuss. This might be a separate meeting, it might be something that you call informally, or it might even be that return to work interview where you're having this discussion. We will want to find out what the underlying cause or causes of absence is. Are the absences linked to one another? Are they all for similar reasons, or are they actually all for very different reasons? We want to try and understand, is there an underlying issue here that we need to address? what actions can be set or taken to alleviate the impact of the health issues on attendance. So key here is that we're always trying to manage attendance. Unless the reason for absence is work related, there's not as much we can do. You might have private medical insurance offerings, you might have employee assistance programs that you can refer employees to help. And if there is a work related angle to the absence, we would absolutely want to try and help with that and ensure that that is addressed. And we want to agree those targets for improvement, including timescales. So make sure that when we are agreeing those targets, remember the SMART acronym if you can. So we want to be very specific. Most importantly, we want to have that timescale in there, because if it's open-ended, it's very hard to then say whether someone has actually met that target or not. Confirm any discussions in writing. So this could be just an email afterwards to just explain this is what we've discussed and this is what we've agreed going forward. It avoids any ambiguity for either party going forwards. And make sure you set review meetings. So if you have set that timescale with targets for improvement, if you said we need to see such and such an improvement within a month, we'll set a review meeting for that month so that it's in the diary and you know you are going to be having that conversation, and so does the employee as well. Keep good records. I never apologise for saying this too much because records are so important, not only for absence management, for all aspects of people management. So keep records of those conversations, any points that the employee raises as well, along with the absence records themselves. And again, we want to just manage expectations with regards to consequences. So whilst this is an informal meeting, the idea is to help the employee improve their absence. But ultimately, if this doesn't work, we should be making it clear to the employee that we hope it does work, but if it doesn't, our next step will be more formal action, which might be disciplinary action. So long-term absence, slightly different in terms of how we manage it. And whilst it's not a legal definition of long-term absence, I would suggest that anyone who is off sick for 4 weeks consecutively or more is considered long-term. And one thing that we would really 99% of the time recommend doing in the case of long-term absence is obtaining occupational health advice. This might be something that you've gone through before with employees, or it might not. But these are independent occupational health professionals, often working for private organisations. The NHS also offers an occupational health service as well. And they can be extremely useful in informing business decisions about reasonable workplace adjustments, return to work plans, and also ongoing employment. So in the case of someone who is off on long-term sickness absence, really at 4 weeks, I would recommend that we start having that conversation with them about obtaining occupational health advice. So employees do need to consent to being referred to occupational health. So the first step would be to have the conversation with the staff member, explain the benefits of a referral to occupational health, explain that actually as a business we do need to understand how we can support the individual, how we can start thinking about a return to work plan, but making sure that's done in a safe way, given that they're currently unwell or unable to work. Once the employee agrees, assuming that they do, you can make that referral where you will send details about the employee's absence and their health and their role to the occupational health professional, and they will conduct an assessment where they will meet, normally virtually or over the telephone, with the employee. And as a result from that meeting or assessment, they will provide you with a report. And those reports are extremely useful, in my experience, for setting out practical steps, practical ideas as to how you can help the employee with a view to getting them back to work. Sometimes, of course, we aren't able to do that, and someone is in such a position that they cannot return in any capacity. But this process of obtaining that medical advice helps you to understand that you've considered all options and not made any assumptions about the person's capability to return to work. And one thing that we would ask in an occupational health referral is what reasonable adjustments should we be considering making to facilitate a return to work for this person. Now, when we get recommendations of reasonable adjustments, or indeed when we're in those early stages and we're thinking, look, we need to start trying to get this person back in, the key thing is talk to the employee, ask them what they think about reasonable adjustments, see what suggestions they have, if they maybe spoke to their GP or consultant about returning to work and what have they suggested. And actually, if we've got any suggestions at this point, let's put them to the employee along with any that the occupational health report might have raised. The key thing is, can we actually do it as a business? Can we do the reasonable adjustment that's being suggested? Reasonable adjustments can be all sorts of things. It could be things like alternative duties. It could be different hours. It might be working from home. It might be physical adaptations to the workplace. We see sometimes things like a parking space nearer to the door or a different chair. It could be all sorts of things. But the key thing is, can you actually do it? Is it practical? The key word here is the reasonable bit. And that's very subjective, and it's purposely like that because every business is different. If we can't actually do the reasonable adjustment that's being proposed or suggested, what alternatives are there? Is there something else that we could look at doing that meets the same objective but is more feasible? And be open-minded as well. Sometimes it can be tempting to say, well, that's not going to work. We know it won't work. Maybe we don't know that. Let's try it. If actually it's something we could try, that's within reason, it's not too costly, it's actually practical, we don't know whether it's going to have an impact until we try it. So just be open-minded about reasonable adjustments as well. As I've mentioned, always take the employee's suggestions on board. Consider whether there's alternative roles as well. We might not be able to adjust the particular role that the employee does, but it might be that there's other roles in the business that we could look at for them. We've seen this before with more manual jobs where we've been able to offer a more admin-based job on a temporary level just to help get them back into the working mindset, and I've seen that work really well before. And adjustments, as I mentioned, can be temporary, but they can be permanent as well. So temporary adjustments are normally there to help facilitate that return to work, make sure the return to work is positive and doesn't cause a setback to the employee. But sometimes actually permanent adjustments are required if somebody does have a long-term health issue that's now stopping them from being able to work as they did before. Permanent adjustments might be needed. And the key thing with reasonable adjustments is that there is a legal duty on employers to consider them. It's not just something that's nice to do or best practice. It is a legal obligation. So do make sure you're giving full consideration. And what's reasonable is going to come down very much to your particular business and the particular role that the employee does as well. There's no right or wrong here. The circumstances are absolutely relevant. So I can't tell you now what a reasonable adjustment is in your business without knowing in detail what your business is, what resources you have available, what this particular employee does, and what the future looks like for the business and all those things. It's very, very relevant. So thinking about the effectiveness of the reasonable adjustment is key as well. What actual impact is it going to have? Is it going to have a big impact? As in, is the adjustment going to mean that they can do some work, whereas that previously they couldn't? If actually the impact is so small, it might not actually be reasonable to do the adjustment if it's going to cost loads of money but have such a small impact. And the cost is completely relevant as well. Your financial situation or your business's financial situation are completely relevant. Feasibility, so how practical actually is it? Your business type and size are completely relevant as well. The resources that you've got available, these are all very, very relevant things. So you're going to have to go through this process when faced with having to consider reasonable adjustments for someone. Go through each of these things and actually just say, look, is it practical? I have seen situations where employers have made tens of reasonable adjustments for an individual, and actually the impact has been zero. The employee still wasn't reaching targets despite all the reasonable adjustments that were put in place. And that's a good example of adjustments not being reasonable at all because they had no impact. So always consider that we're trying to adjust to improve the situation, not to have it stay the same. So in the case of long-term absence, again, we're going to want to action plan. So regular contact, you remember I suggested that this was put within the absence policy. How often are we going to keep in contact? The longer someone is off and the longer they are off without contact, the harder it's going to be to get in touch with them and get them back to work positively. People can begin feeling isolated. It can make it very awkward. So do take the initiative to keep in contact with them and agree the level of contact when someone is off sick. If they put a doctor's note in for 4 weeks or 2 months, just set the expectation that, I'm going to give you a ring on a Friday. Is that okay? Just to see how you're doing. Meet and visit them. So whilst you might agree a weekly telephone call, you might also, partway through the absence, suggest that you meet for a coffee or visit them at home. Depending on the nature of their illness or injury, it might not be appropriate to, but you can always suggest a meeting, and it actually is nice to show that you're reaching out to the employee, you've not forgotten them, and also that you're not cross at them for being off sick. The medical report or occupational health report is absolutely key for long-term absence management, considering reasonable adjustments, going through that return to work process. So again, you'd follow your return to work interview for long-term absence as you would with short-term absence. And once the person's returned to work, we're going to really want to be doing regular reviews with them as well to make sure that that return to work is successful, particularly if someone's been off for a very long time. It can be quite common to see someone return and have to go off sick again because it's not managed in the best way. Again, keep notes and records of what's done. And in the worst case scenario, we'll talk about this on the next slide, if a return to work is unsuccessful, we've tried reasonable adjustments and they've not worked or they're not practical, dismissal on capability grounds is a potential outcome of long-term absence. And the key question we get asked is, well, when is it okay to dismiss? And there isn't an answer to that question. The key things are that it is a last resort. We need to have considered everything else before we get to the point of dismissing for capability. Have you tried the reasonable adjustments that have been recommended? Have you at least considered those that maybe aren't feasible? Have you tried to change the job role at all? Have you maybe tried part-time or flexible working? And I would want to see records of all these considerations as well. So if you're ever challenged on it, you're going to need to show evidence that you actually considered these things. So make records of considerations, even if it is just your thought processes, get them down in record form. And do you have medical evidence to support your decision? I would strongly advise against dismissing anyone on capability grounds without medical evidence. I would suggest it's quite risky to do that. The key thing with any dismissal, as you'll probably know, is a fair process. We can't simply have someone off sick and then decide to dismiss them. We're going to need to have meetings. We're going to have consultation type meetings, really, where we're making them aware of the potential consequences. We're working with them to try and find an alternative, but we're letting them know that actually a potential outcome here, if we can't find an alternative, is that your employment might be terminated. They need to be understanding that we have tried everything. We don't want to ever be dismissing someone where they feel that you've just jumped to the decision and you've not really considered other options. And dismissal for capability would come with a notice period. So that would be statutory notice or contractual notice if contractual notice is higher than statutory. And that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for attending. Depending on the date that you're watching this webinar, we do have another one coming up on the 23rd of May 2023, and that's on performance management. We have run a number of webinars so far, and they are available on our website if you'd like to have a look at those. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope you found it useful.